conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, there's been a slew of articles in the media covering Whitney Westerfield, as in the Herald Leader wrote 3 in just a 2-day span. Why? Because he's an outgoing Republican state senator who has found the courage to trash the Republican Party and Donald Trump on his way out, and that is like catnip to the liberal media. So, of course, they're going to give him tons of coverage and bestow upon him a strange new respect in general. So I wanted to go over one of those articles. Also, Beshear has been vetoing a lot of things as we're coming into these final 2 days of session. And so we'll go over a few of the things he's vetoed to see that the legislature is looking at overcoming. And also, House Bill 509 is getting a lot of attention. I'll go over what's in that as well. In these final 2 days, is House Bill 509 going to pass? A lot of people talking about it. So we'll cover that all today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. But first, I had a viewer send in a question. This is from Larry, and if you have a question or a show topic you want covered, feel free to send it to info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com, or you can head on over to theandrewshow.com and click the contact tab. There's a contact form there, and you can fill that out if you want to go ahead and send something over. So Larry had sent me a survey and asked if it was good to fill those out. So come election season, you're going to start to get, if you are a often primary voter, right? So in the world of politics, we have something called, 1 out of 4 voters, 2 out of 2 voters, 3 out of 3 voters, 3 out of 4 voters. And what we're referencing there is how often you vote. And so if you have voted in 3 or 4 of the last 3 or 4 primaries, you're almost guaranteed that you're going to get text messages to your phone, or you're going to get mailers in your mailbox, emails. You're going to get contacted in a variety of different ways. And one of those ways they do that is they ask you sometimes to fill out a survey. And sometimes these surveys are just that, an actual survey where some group or entity is trying to figure out exactly where the race is falling. But there can be a secondary purpose to the survey when it's being sent out by a candidate. And so sometimes these are what's called push surveys. And push surveys will have very specific questions in the survey. And it's funny because there's a lot of ways you can phrase things without making it sound like you're actually saying they did something. And so you can get around some of the legality of just making up things about your opponents as much as leeway as there is, because you can say things like, for an example, let's say I send you a push survey. And so this will start out like a normal survey, and maybe you've gotten these sent to your phone during campaigns, but you get sent a survey from somebody that says, hey, we want to hear your voice. So you sign in or you click a link, and it says, might ask you about Donald Trump, might ask you about candidates, who you're voting for, who you're not initially. And based on what you pick determines what they show you next. And so if you say, for an example, you're saying, I'm going to vote for John Smith, and you click that. Well, the next question on the survey could be, if you found out that John Smith wanted to take away your guns, would you be more likely to vote for him or less likely to vote for him? And whatever you pick, it kind of really doesn't matter, because the implication, of course, to you taking the survey is that John Smith wants to take away your guns. You would believe that was the case because, of course, they're asking the question that way. Now, that could be a stretch of the truth. It could be not the truth at all. They could be what's called messaging testing, seeing what issues to push on in order to figure out what kind of things will you react to the most, what kind of things will cause you to come off your vote. So if you say, I'm going to vote for John Smith, and they say, if you find, John Smith murdered puppies, now knowing this, are you more likely or less likely to vote for him? If you say less likely, and so does a lot of other people on that issue, now they know when they run their ads, when they run their targeting, their mailers, and if they can only afford to attack on a few issues, those will be the things they attack on. So that's the purpose of those surveys, and they can take different forms. Like I said, the survey in this case that Larry was asking about seems to be an actual survey that was just trying to figure out where a race falls. And you'll have a lot of outside groups sometimes send those surveys, such as the Republican Party of Kentucky will send them out, or the House Caucus Campaign Committee will send them out, or the National Party sometimes, depending on the size of the race and where it is. If it's a congressional primary, they may send it out because they're trying to figure out the ground of the race, to figure out if they want to throw money in behind a candidate or not, to see if anybody even is aware of what's going on in the district, to see what people think of their current representation of the district. And it's really just to figure out, hey, is this something we want to get involved in? Is it worth us spending our time, our money, our effort in this race? And in which side possibly do we want to do that on? Who do we think is going to win? How much help do they need in order to win? And so if they're just asking you questions like that, it could be any of the candidates. It could be an outside group trying to figure out. Now, the minute you get a push survey, and the minute that they start asking you some questions that are clearly shaped in a negative light towards one candidate or another, that'll tell you right away that this survey is a push survey and it's coming from the other guy. And so the question was, are these useful to do? And it somewhat depends. If it is one of those surveys where they're just asking you straight up questions, they're not trying to push you in a direction or not, they're just trying to figure out the lay of the land. Yeah, it could be useful to answer the questions honestly and handle them. If it is a push survey, it could be useful for you to answer them for your candidate that you do support, in order so that way, the opponent thinks to themselves that nothing is going to work, or they should just give up. It could be demoralizing to them. But at the same time, if not a lot of people answer them as well, they may think it's not worthwhile to keep sending them out. And so it's a few different ideas. Generally speaking, if I get sent them and they do not ask me any more personal information, like my email or my phone number or anything beyond that, it's just a survey. Normally I'll take them just because, I think it's, regardless of what side it falls on, it can be useful for them to realize where people fall. It could end up helping out the guy you support, because obviously it may make the opponent say, ooh, I'm not doing very good, I can't bring in as much money. There's just a lot of choices there. So that I wanted to kind of lay that out. Before the break, I did want to mention, obviously yesterday was the eclipse. And, every year we're told the same thing. You can't look at the eclipse with your phone. You can't take pictures of the eclipse with your phone. I tell you what, I took pictures of eclipse with my phone. You can yell at me all you want to. You can tell me I'm crazy to do that. The eclipse isn't coming up again, so I'm not telling you what to do with your phone at the next eclipse. But I think this, I'm just going to tell you guys, crazy conspiracy theory. I think the glasses, the eclipse glasses industry is lying to us that we can't use our phones. Because now I believe I've been through 2 eclipses, and both times I have used my phone to take pictures of the eclipse, and my phone seems to have done okay both times. Nothing seems damaged. Maybe your phone was, you can tell me about it, but I think it's a conspiracy. I think it's because they want you buying the glasses. I mean, if you're a Eclipse glasses manufacturer, how often do you really get to, manufacture Eclipse glasses and get to make your money off of them? Once every 7 years or so, 8 years or so, at least in America, right? I don't know how often Eclipse happen around the world. There's probably one every year if I had to guess. Anyways, point is I think it's a conspiracy. There you go. There's my crazy conspiracy of the day that I wanted to, share with you all. But coming up after this, we'll talk about Whitney Westerfield's strange new respect he's getting from the media. We'll go through one of these articles and kind of just point out how people just don't hear themselves when they talk, especially people who are full of themselves like Whitney Westerfield. We'll have that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Over the last few days, the Herald Leader has wrote several articles about Whitney Westerfield, state senator. He just finished up his last session, who after 12 years in office has decided he's not running for re-election, even though he's relatively young. He's 35 years old. He's 43 years old. And he's decided, I'm not going to run for office again. And this has left a few people to now have a strange new respect for him. And one of those being Linda Blackford, who's wrote many of these articles, because Whitney Westerfield is willing to now tell you how he feels. And he blames, so if you follow him on Twitter at all, I don't, but if you see any of his comments at all, or even through this article, he's going to blame Republicans. He's going to blame his party. He's going to blame a lot of things, but he says a few things about himself changing that I think he really needs to zero in on himself and perhaps realize that the party hasn't changed. He has more. And that people are no longer, there has been a change in politics over the last 4 years or so, and that is a lot more people, I believe, are more engaged. And also, as technologies come along, as people realize the control that your state government has over your lives, as they realized with COVID, a lot more people started paying more attention to their state governments. And nationally, when you're under more scrutiny and you're getting more attention paid to you, you wouldn't be having, quote unquote, as much fun. But let's also keep in mind as well, he ran for office. He's been in for 12 years. So that means the first time he won would have been 2012, 12 years ago. Well, for 4 years, they weren't in the majority. His first 4 years, they weren't in the majority even. And then they did become in the majority, he was in the majority still in the Senate because Republicans grabbed control of the Senate in 1999. But in the House, the Republicans were not in control of the House until technically the year 2017. So from 2012 to 2016, his first 4 years, he in the Senate was having to deal with a House that was controlled by the Democrats. And then his second 4 years was when they were first kind of taking over control-ish of the time. And then 2020 comes into play. And in 2020, that's when now the last time he ran for re-election, because obviously he's up again this time, but he decided not to run. So comparing to where you started to where you are now, if anything, and as he says, he's changed, you would look to say being in power, being able to get things done, is that what changed you? And I want to reference this article here because I want you to hear kind of in his own words what he's saying. And I'm referencing an article by Linda Blackford that says Whitney Westerfield is leaving Frankfurt. Why? He's changed, but his party's changed more, which is a lot to say. But anyways, we'll continue. Starting off in the article, on February 8th, State Senator Whitney Westerfield drove to the Chamber of Commerce dinner in Lexington. He did not want to go. He'd had a terrible day, a genuinely crappy day, where he watched some of the changes he'd made in the Kentucky juvenile justice system begin to be unraveled by his colleagues. Criminal justice reform was about to be decimated by House Bill 5, and Donald Trump was once again about to become the GOP nominee for president. Oh, how awful. Oh, Donald Trump is going to become the nominee for president. That's so bad for Whitney. Anyways, but then as the Fruit Hill Republican made his way to his table at the back of the room with all the other people filtering in, people started stopping him to shake his hand. They kept thanking me for what I was doing, Westerfield said. I lost count of these people that I'd never met, but they knew who I was. That's how that genuinely crappy day ended. And it felt great because I felt like I'm not out here all alone. I'm not the only one who feels this way. I'm not patting myself on the back. It was just nice to know there were other people who feel the same way. Now, there's some key things here, okay? So he says he didn't know who these people were that were coming up to say hello to him, which tells you they're probably not Republicans. Why do you know this? Because he himself says he didn't recognize these people. He's never knew them before, but they knew him. Now, if they were Republicans heavily involved in state politics, He would know who they were. They would know who he is. They will have talked before. Trust me on this, okay? The world of politics isn't that big. It's just not. On the Republican side of things, it's not that big of a world. It just isn't. On Democrat side, too, it isn't that big. Now, those two worlds, a lot of times, don't often clash. Like if you're active, really active on the Democrat side and you're really active on the Republican side, unless you've been across from each other on candidates, for an example, and happen to know, you actually don't know as much who each other is from the other parties. But within the parties, you know who each other is. You just do. And so the fact that for 12 years, he's at Chamber of Commerce dinner, which is a very political event, and he's saying, hey, there's people coming up to me I didn't know, supporting me, telling me I'm great. So rather than taking a moment to realize that these are Democrats saying hello to you. Yes, Whitney, you're not alone. You're not alone in what you think. You're definitely not. You're just not a Republican. And you need to accept that. You're not a Republican. These people who are saying they agree with you are not of your party. That should tell you something. But he goes on to say that he feels very alone in the Senate because he's changed and his party has changed and Frankfurt has changed. And frankly, the three things just aren't syncing as well. And so he admits that he has changed. He admits that he no longer syncs up well with the Republican Party. Now, he goes on to say, this is where he thinks that the Senate GOP doesn't like him anymore, and this is how he describes himself. He says the Senate GOP didn't have much space for an evangelical Christian anti-abortion hardliner who thought government that banned abortion needed to pay more attention to helping families and children. They didn't want to listen to him preach about how putting more people in jail would not lower crime rates. They didn't want to support his attempts to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. So right there, he's talking about he's talking about how he's an anti-abortion hardliner. There's plenty of space for an evangelical Christian anti-abortion hardliner. There's plenty of space. But where he hits a roadblock is when he says that, well, if you're banning abortions, then you need to pay more attention to helping families and children. That isn't Republican. That isn't conservative. That's welfare type actions. You're talking about taking money from people and giving it money to other people for the decisions they make. If you're just talking about victims of rape or incest or something, that'd be a different conversation, but he's not. He's saying that the government needs to do more to help families and children, and that, I'm sorry, and I'm going to say it, is not a conservative viewpoint. That is not the government's role. The government only hurts families and children. That is the conservative viewpoint, and they hurt them by taking money out of hardworking families' pockets and giving it to other people in order to make the taxpayers pay for the decisions being made by those who can't seem to understand that maybe they should think before they go ahead and decide to engage in activities that result in children. Why should my tax dollars go to somebody just because they can't make good life decisions? Why is that on me? That isn't conservative. And that also isn't Christian either. The Christian thing to do is to help those less fortunate. The Christian thing isn't to pay for somebody else's decision making. And if you don't do it, and if you don't use the government to force other people to pay in too, then that makes you a bad person. What else does he say? He said they didn't want to listen to him preach about how putting more people in jail would not lower crime rates, which is objectively false. We've talked about this. More people in jail lowers crime rates. It's just how it works. The number one indicator that you're going to commit a crime is that you've committed a crime before. That's like most people who commit crimes are people who've committed crimes before. And so if you're locking up people longer in jail, objectively speaking, it does lower the crime rate. Now, it's a trade-off, right? There's liberty compared to freedom and so on and so forth. And if you want to make that argument, make that argument. But don't sit here and act like we're all idiots because we understand the basic concept that if you put people in jail for longer, it lowers crime rates. Of course it does. Of course it does. And then he goes on to say, and they didn't support his attempts to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. Now, of course, he's not being honest there. What he's talking about is his attempt to pass red flag laws, which take the guns away from citizens, take constitutional rights away from citizens that haven't been diagnosed by a mental health professional, that haven't been diagnosed by anybody. Just somebody went to your local police and said, I don't want him to have guns. And the police go to the courts and say, hey, can we take this guy's guns away? And the courts, a judge who's not a mental health professional, makes a decision and then goes and takes the guns away. Then finally he ends on Trump. He says, and they do not like to see him pillory Trump and his ilk on a frequent basis on X, formerly Twitter, like he did when Trump started hawking Trump Bibles during Easter. Just gross, Westerfield wrote. Here's a dirty little secret about Whitney Westerfield. In 2015, Whitney Westerfield ran for Attorney General, and he lost to Andy Beshear, and that was in 2015. So in 2019, he wanted to run for Attorney General again. So inside baseball. That was when Daniel Cameron was running. And the McConnell people came along to Whitney Westerfield and said, if you run, here's all these tweets where you've attacked Trump during the primaries. And we're going to hold your feet to the fire on that. We're going to we're just going to bury you with it. We're going to slaughter you in campaign-wise with these comments you've made about Trump. And so Whitney Westerfield isn't actually mad at Trump. Whitney Westerfield is mad at the Republican base for loving Trump so much that the fact that he talked bad about him during a primary would now be a liability during an election. That's what he's mad about. Be very clear. It's not to do with anything specifically about Trump, but his actual hate for Trump stems from the fact that he blames the quote-unquote fanatical base's love of Trump for the reason why he didn't run for Attorney General in 2019. Coming up after this, Beshear's vetoed a few bills. We'll go over a few of those. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. You know, before the break, I said I was going to go over some of Beshear's vetoes. I'm going to do that last. Actually, I think I want to cover House Bill 509 first. So House Bill 509, for those of you who are unaware, I covered this once on the show before. It's a House bill that is sponsored by John Hodgson, and it deals with the open records request laws here in Kentucky. And so right now, how it's interpreted, how the law works, is you can ask for the records pertaining to any situation. So for an example, I can say, hey, I want to have any and all communications, notes, emails, text messages, anything regarding the conversation about Andrew Cooperrider's liquor license to the ABC board. And they have to furnish you with that information. And right now, it opens up the ability you can, it doesn't matter what the device is on, doesn't matter if it's a private cell phone, a non-government email account. If they are conducting official business, they're supposed to turn that over. And what this law would seek to do is say that, private emails, private cell phones, private whatever, are no longer available to open records requests, but the entities have to issue a email address to the individuals, and then those email addresses will be the communications that's up for search. So basically, the law says that government officials have to use the government email addresses that they're given, and if they're issued a government cell phone, to conduct business, government business on, and they shouldn't be conducting government business on any other devices, private devices or private emails, and that those private devices, private emails are not available for search to open records requests. Now, there's a lot of people, including in the media and elsewhere, who are coming out and calling this bill out as a problem. And the reason why is because when this bill was kind of first proposed, and I was first talking to John Hodgson about it, it seemed to be limiting the records you could get, and he took that away, so it did get better, where he wasn't limiting down the amount of records that you could access. He did improve that part of the bill, but there was another part of the bill when it came to these personal devices that there would be an actual punishment for a legal punishment for failing to keep your communications onto the state devices, onto the state emails, the state phones, the state whatever. And that failure to do so, if you're caught for doing it, would result in punishment. Well, now, though, with the bill put forward, it does enable boards and commissioners to be removed from the board or commission if they don't follow the agreement. If it's discovered that they're conducting, basically conducting business not on just this government email addresses and so on and so forth. But it doesn't add any kind of legal ramifications, and there is actually no requirement and no punishments for elected people. And so while legislators do have some immunity to open records requests right now in law, the people like the governor's office, the treasurer, those kinds of people, they don't enjoy that same immunity. And so this would basically say that those who are elected, they really wouldn't have any repercussions. There's no legal repercussions. There's no anything, it looks like in this bill, for an elected official that conducts government business on a non-government device. But those non-government devices are also now not up for searching. And there's nothing in the bill, it would appear, and this was an issue brought up by, I believe the Kentucky Lantern brought this up. There's nothing in the bill to stop government officials from messaging on other messaging apps too. And those aren't up for search either, such as Signal or as such. So if they want to improve the law, the improvement would be to actually attach some pretty big ramifications for if you fail to only communicate on the government issued, devices, email addresses, etc. Now, the reason why John Hodgson says he's putting this bill out there, he says he's not trying to limit down what people have access to or don't have access to. He says that when you've got a lot of these volunteer boards, for example, your local county fair board was an example he gave, where these people are volunteer, they're not paid, and they're now subject to any and all open records requests, asking them questions, and their devices are up for search just because they have a government commission job that is actually volunteer. And it's hard to find people to fulfill those government position and volunteer jobs when they find out that their devices have to be searched all the time, their personal devices. Now, another thing that John Hodgson pointed to, though, was, it's hard to attract in talent to the government because you're telling people, hey, take a pay cut, and also your private devices will be up for searches if somebody puts in an open records request. And he's like, that makes it harder to fill roles. But that seems like a very, the average government worker isn't actually concerned about that. He's clearly talking about high-level cabinet appointee positions, and I would argue those are the exact people that we want to have the most amount of oversight on. And so obviously the law is hitting a lot of pushback. What's really funny to me is seeing a lot of the more liberal members of our media and liberal people, the talking heads, what have you, realize that Andy Beshear is still a politician, because Andy Beshear is literally out here saying, no, this won't affect anything. Just trust me, guys. You can trust me, right? He literally was like, oh, you guys know me. You can trust me. And the media is like, I don't know if we do. Hold on a second. And they're actually calling out Andy Beshear for his support of this bill, because it obviously gives him, it gives Andy Beshear a little bit of coverage too as well that he wouldn't normally have. But his support for 509, and he was asked about it. He didn't comment. He didn't say he would veto it. He said, I'll have to look at it when it comes. But it seems like Andy Beshear wants the bill. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if House Bill 509 gets passed. They reconvene on Friday. And so we'll see if when they come together, they do end up going ahead and passing that particular law. Speaking of Governor Beshear, a bunch of bills have landed on his desk. It is now the veto period. He's got, I think, like one more day, today or tomorrow, to veto or sign or allow to pass into law any of the bills that have landed on his desk that then the legislature will have to look at overcoming on Friday and Saturday. this week. I wanted to cover a few of those vetoes that he's issued. I think the first one I want to talk about is Senate Bill 198. Senate Bill 198 was establishing the nuclear energy in Kentucky having its own board, and you could maybe see why you would maybe think it's necessary for Kentucky to have its own board for nuclear energy, considering I don't think we're making a whole lot of pushes or headways for that in Kentucky. I don't know if that's something we should really pursue, or if that's something, I don't know if I really support or don't support a nuclear energy plant in Kentucky. It is one of the cleanest, cheapest versions of power, of course. Saying they shouldn't or shouldn't, but the governor vetoed that. He said he kind of sort of doesn't like nuclear energy having its own board, but he kind of really doesn't mind it. He cited the reason for his veto was because he said that the governor doesn't appoint enough people to the board himself, and he doesn't like the structure of the board or the funding levels compared to the mandates that the board is given. But one thing you're going to find in all of these vetoes is a lot of them have to do with Andy Beshear saying, I'm not having enough power here, or I believe I have more power than that, so I'm vetoing it because you're violating my powers. You're encroaching on my powers as governor. And some of these things that he claims as his powers are very, very interesting. In fact, in one of these vetoes, he essentially asserts that when it comes to regulations regarding boards, he could be a dictator. I'm not kidding. We're going to go over that veto. That was a veto on Senate Bill 65. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So the governor's vetoed a slew of bills. Senate Bill 65, I want to stop off at, okay? So Senate Bill 65 was a bill to basically end some provisions that the Cabinet for Health and Family Services made when it came to Medicaid, basically deciding to expand out state services without the legislature passing a law. And so it did that, but the bill also deals with the provision of a social work board regulation as well. And it's not as much important to what we're talking about regarding what the provision actually is, because the story I'm focusing in here isn't about whether you agree or disagree with the social worker provision, that regulation that the bill was taking aim at, but rather why Beshear says he vetoed it. And so when we look at the veto message for Senate Bill 65, every time the governor vetoes a bill here in Kentucky, he also normally attaches a veto message saying why he vetoed it. And this is what he said. He said some other things, but this is the part I want to zero in on. Senate Bill 65 also attempts to void an administrative regulation of the Board of Social Work, an executive branch board that state law and the Kentucky Constitution mandate that the governor make the final decision on. We got to look at what he's saying here. So he's claiming that Senate Bill 65 is an unconstitutional encroachment into the power of the executive branch because it attempts to void an administrative regulation of the Board of Social Work, and he believes that according to the governor, that's only the governor who gets to make the final decision on it. Now, the first idea that you can kind of take that the governor is making stabs in the dark here is he cites state law and Kentucky Constitution mandate. Now, state law doesn't actually matter when it comes to what you're passing a bill on, because if you're passing a piece of legislation, current law says you can't do that. Well, the new piece of legislation you're passing can literally just say, yes, you can, and it rewrites the laws. I mean, that's what you're writing. You're writing laws. You can change laws. If when it comes to the legislature passing laws, they don't have to follow state laws because they get to write whatever they want when it comes to laws. They can change any law they want to. That's how it works. That's how laws are made. And I know Beshear maybe doesn't know that, but I want to make sure you know that. So any kind of claim that you can't, that a bill that's passed by the legislature violates state law. So any kind of claim that a bill violates state law, I mean, all you can be claiming is that the bill doesn't accurately edit current state laws to reflect the change that's being made. You could make that claim. It was poorly written. But you can't say it like violates state law, if that makes sense. Now, he claims, however, that the Kentucky Constitution somehow protects the governor and have supreme control over all administrative regulations issued by a board. So keep in mind, this is the Board of Social Work. This board was created by the legislature. The Board of Social Work did not exist. It doesn't exist in our state constitution. Nowhere in our state constitution does it say the Board of Social Work has to exist. It was literally formed as an entity by our legislature. And Beshear is now claiming once the legislature creates the entity, they can't control the purview of the entity at all. They can't pass a law saying that the regulation made by the board is wrong and they can't make that regulation, which is patently ridiculous. The idea that the legislature can't pass a law that violates an administrative regulation makes no constitutional sense at all. That'd be like saying that when the governor or board that the governor's over makes a policy that supersedes actual law passed by our legislators. That'd be like saying that if the legislators pass a law saying that barbers don't have to get licensed, but the governor turns around and says, no, the Board of Cosmetology says barbers do have to get licensed, that somehow the Board of Cosmetology would have veto power over the legislature saying, no, that regulation's null and void. That is a non-limiting belief. That is a dictatorial process. And if that's even close to accurate, it would need to be fixed, but that's not accurate. He doesn't actually cite what sections of the Constitution he claims it violates. He just says, well, you know, it's the constitutional purview of the executive branch to adopt any regulations it wants. And the General Assembly, you know, they can't pass a bill or resolution to void any regulation already in effect. That's an unconstitutional encroachment. So basically, if a board beats them to it, then the legislature can't do anything about it. That's what he's trying to argue. And it's ridiculous. This thought process is ridiculous, in my opinion. If he wants to veto it, but you don't need to sit there and assert claims that you somehow get to create any administrative regulation you want and the legislators can't say anything about it and pretend the Constitution's on your side. That doesn't make sense. Another thing, because what if they just end the board completely? They can do that. It's not a constitutional board. It's not mandated. Anyways. Also, another bill I want to point out that he vetoed was Senate Bill 259, and that deals with the West End Opportunity Board. Okay, so I'm going to take a second and try to explain this board to you because so something happened in 2021. Our Republican legislators kind of broke. You know, when the whole George Floyd, Breonna Taylor thing happened and the whole Black Lives Matter thing started marching, you know, the Republican legislators in Kentucky decided that this could be an opportunity for them to grab the quote-unquote minority vote, that it was right for the picking because there was unrest in all these liberal cities, and if they came in with the right messaging at the right time, they could pick up the minority vote, something that if Republicans ever picked up a significant percentage of, Democrats would never win again. And it's noble for them to want to do that, but what ends up happening is Republicans end up going against key conservative principles. Why? Because the way that Democrats keep the minority vote is they make a whole lot of false promises. They claim everyone's a victim in their community, and then they promise those communities that they will get special treatment and special handouts for the government. Now, of course, these special treatments and handouts never actually fix anything, and it continues them, but the problem is that anytime we start hearing pitches about quote unquote how to message to minorities in Republican circles, it always goes with they want to hear what the Republican Party is going to do for them. Somebody said that to Ron Paul once when he was running for president. He said, you've got a great message and I want to bring it to the minority community. I think you could pick up a lot of the minority community. You just got to message in a way that they can understand what you're going to do for them. And Ron Paul said, let me stop you there because I'm not going to do anything for them special. I promise to treat them the exact same way that the government will treat every other American citizen. The government is not going to do anything special for any certain group of people based upon their skin color. That is a conservative principle. the idea that everybody's equal under the law, everybody's equal under the government. And so anytime we start seeing Republicans get a little wily here, they decide that they're going to start doing some more, they decided in 2021 they're going to try to message and do some things to help bring in the minority vote. And this is, for an example, when the Commission on Race and Access to Equal Opportunity was formed, a literal DEI commission that was basically set up to push diversity, equity, inclusion policies. It's a pretty crazy board. I cover it in the off season a lot of times because the types of hearings they have is just frankly patently ridiculous. At the same time, they passed a bill which created the West End Opportunity Board. It's something called a TIF, and that's a tax improvement situation. And so basically, it's a board that gets formed so they set a level of tax revenue into an area. So let's say an area is bringing in $10 million in tax revenue. So they set like a kind of like a council of that area. And then that government group will get a certain percentage of any taxes, any new taxes. So this group was set up to where it pulls in 80% of every dollar made beyond the amount of tax money being brought in the district. So in West End, Louisville, any money more, 80% of every dollar made over the amount of tax money they were start making in 2021 off that district at the city level would go now to this improvement district in order to direct and make improvements in the West End. Well, there's been some issues now with this West End Opportunity Board that Senate Bill 259 is looking to work at. I know you guys are going to hate me for this, but I'm coming up on the end of today. So we'll cover the rest of Senate Bill 259, what everything it kind of does in tomorrow's show. Gives you a reason to tune back in. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll see you back here tomorrow. We'll cover the TIF happening at West End Opportunity Board between the NAACP and the rest of the board. It's quite fascinating. Until then, we'll be seeing you.